I had worked as a freight conductor for Norfolk Southern for 23 years. Most of those years were spent on overnight runs through Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, and the western edge of Virginia. I was not the kind of railroader who treated rules as suggestions. I carried laminated track bulletins in my grip even after most crews trusted tablets. I knew how to read a signal in fog by the color reflected on wet ballast. I knew how to walk a train in the dark, how to check an angle cock by feel, how to protect a shove, how to call out a slow order, and how to ask a dispatcher twice when the authority sounded even a little wrong. My usual engineer was Mario Morgan. Mario had the same habits I did. He kept a grease pencil tucked behind one ear and marked every unexpected stop on the back of his paperwork. Not because anyone asked him to. He did it because he had once seen a missed brake line defect put 2 cars on the ground outside Bellevue, Ohio. Our work depended on systems that were supposed to make emptiness manageable. Dispatchers gave authorities. Signals divided track into blocks. Positive train control watched speed and movement. Yardmasters confirmed consists. Defect detectors spoke from trackside boxes in flat mechanical voices. But those systems had holes. There were radio shadows in Appalachian cuts, dead places beside the Ohio River, long stretches of dark territory where the crew had only paperwork, mileposts, and procedure. A freight train could be 10,000 feet long and still feel like a small room if it stopped in the wrong hollow after midnight. I learned that the hard way. The first incident happened on a January night west of Fostoria, Ohio. Mario and I were taking a mixed freight toward Fort Wayne. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and fog lay flat over the farm fields, cutting the world down to the locomotive ditch lights, the first few cars, and the dull shine of rail disappearing behind us. Just after 1:10 in the morning, the brake pipe pressure began bleeding off. Mario eased the train down. He called the emergency over the radio and brought us to a stop beside a gravel maintenance access road near a dark grain siding off the CSX and Norfolk Southern crossing territory. I stepped down with my lantern, reflective vest zipped high, and started walking the ballast to find the leak. Before Mario and I could finish the inspection, amber strobes rolled out of the fog. A white high-rail pickup came down the access road and stopped close to the locomotive. 2 men in orange vests got out. The older one introduced himself as Colton Tran and said he was a track maintenance foreman sent by dispatch to help isolate a stuck angle cock near the middle of the train. The younger man, Cole Bush, said almost nothing and kept his hard hat low. Their truck had magnetic Norfolk Southern markings on the doors, but no visible unit number on the bumper. The company logo looked slightly too large. Colton knew our train symbol. He knew Mario's last radio call. He knew the milepost where we had stopped. He also kept telling me that the problem was another 10 cars down. Even when I counted past 20, I stopped walking. Something was wrong. The details were correct, but the truck was not. The directions were not. I pulled my radio and called the dispatcher. The dispatcher assigned to our territory was Denise Gray, a calm, sharp-voiced woman in Atlanta who had talked me through storms, signal failures, and trespasser strikes without ever sounding rattled. Static chewed through my first call. On the second attempt, a voice came back on the road channel using Denise's cadence. It gave a maintenance employee number, a track authority reference, and an instruction for me to comply with Colton's crew. It sounded clean enough that Mario, listening from the cab, repeated it back. Colton smiled as if the matter had been settled. He waved me farther down the ballast, away from the locomotive and into the fog. His arm extended, one gloved hand pointing me deeper along the consist. The static cleared before I took another step. Denise came back on the road channel so fast that Mario grabbed the handset with both hands like he needed to hold it steady. Her voice cut through the open squelch, sharp and angry, in a way I had never heard from her in 23 years of calling her desk. Negative. No maintenance crew has been dispatched to your location. No track authority has been issued for your train symbol. The last transmission I received from you was your initial stop report 10 minutes ago. She paused just long enough to let that land. Return to the locomotive and lock the doors. Do it now. I turned. Colton's smile dropped before Denise finished speaking. Cole raised something short and black from inside his vest. I ran. The crack that followed was not quite a gunshot. It sounded like a pistolized track torpedo, the kind maintenance crews use to warn engineers, and a red flare burst against the ballast beside my boot. The light flooded the fog with a bloody glow that turned the consist into shadow shapes and made the grain siding behind us look like it was on fire. I didn't stop to see what Cole was reloading. I just kept moving. Mario leaned out from the cab door and screamed my name. I fell behind the wheel set of a covered hopper, hit the ballast hard enough to knock the wind out of my lungs, and crawled under the coupler gap while the flare hissed and spit behind me. My coat caught on something sharp beneath the car and tore open across the chest. I came up on the other side with my vest hanging crooked and my lantern still strapped to my belt. The train sat between me and Colton now. That felt like the only good fact I had. I could hear them moving, not running, not shouting, just working both sides of the cars in a way that told me they had rehearsed this. Colton checked the left side. Cole checked the right. They knew where a conductor would hide. They knew how long it took to crawl under a car. They knew which gaps were too tight and which couplers sat high enough to let a man through if he kept his head down and his grip close. Mario laid on the horn, long emergency blasts that carried across the fields and made the fog ripple like water. 5 seconds on, 2 seconds off, 5 seconds on again. The sound was so loud it hurt, but I was glad for it because it meant Mario was still in the cab and still had his hand on something he could control. Denise came back over the radio. County has been notified. Railroad Police ETA is 12 minutes. You are authorized restricted speed to milepost 218 when you confirm your conductor is secure in the cab. Mario's voice came through ragged. He's not in the cab yet. Then keep that door open and keep talking to me. I moved. I stayed low and kept the train between myself and the grain siding. My boots crunched on the ballast. The fog was thick enough that I couldn't see more than 2 car lengths ahead, but I could see the glow from the lead unit's ditch lights, and that was enough. I passed under another coupler. My coat snagged again. I yanked it free and kept going. Somewhere behind me, Cole said something I couldn't make out. Colton answered him in a voice that was still calm, still controlled, like they were finishing a job that had a checklist and a timeline. I reached the locomotive because Mario kept the cab door open and because Denise kept the radio channel live. She told Mario when the deputies were rolling. She told him when Drew Palmer was 10 minutes out. She told him exactly what restricted speed meant and what milepost he could move to once I was inside. Her voice never wavered. It was the same voice that had talked me through storms and signal failures, and one night when a driver had ignored the gates at a crossing near Bellevue, and I'd had to stop the train and walk back to see if anyone in the car was still alive. I grabbed the handrail and pulled myself up the steps. Mario slammed the door behind me and threw the lock. We didn't speak. We just stood there breathing hard while the horn kept blasting and Denise kept the channel open. Outside, the fog pressed against the windshield like something alive. I couldn't see Colton. I couldn't see Cole. I couldn't see their truck or the grain siding or anything except the red flare dying on the ballast 30 car lengths back. Denise's voice came through one more time. "When you're ready, take it slow to 218. I'll stay with you until County reaches your position." Mario released the independent brake and eased the throttle forward. The train moved. I sat down in the conductor's seat and watched the fog slide past the window. My hands were shaking. My coat was torn. My vest had a streak of grease across the front from crawling under the hopper. I didn't care. I was in the cab. The door was locked. Mario was beside me. Denise was on the radio. Those were the only facts that mattered. By the time we reached milepost 218, the amber strobes were already there. County arrived first. 2 Seneca County cruisers with their lights cutting through the fog like something out of a dream I didn't want to finish. Norfolk Southern Police showed up 6 minutes later. Drew Palmer stepped out of an unmarked sedan with a railroad windbreaker zipped high and a camera bag slung over one shoulder. He knocked on the cab door twice, identified himself, and waited for Mario to unlock it before he climbed inside. "You two all right?" I nodded. Mario said yes. Drew looked at my torn coat and the grease on my vest. "Did they touch you?" "No. One of them fired something. A flare, I think. Cracked like a torpedo." "Show me where." I led him back down the ballast with my lantern while Mario stayed in the cab with the door locked. The flare had burned out, but the scorched ballast was still there, and so was the divot where I'd fallen behind the hopper's wheel set. Drew photographed both. Then he walked the rest of the consist with me, checking every coupler gap and every place I'd crawled under. He didn't ask if I was sure about what had happened. He just documented it. When we reached the end of the train, he looked toward the grain siding. "They went that way?" "Yes." "Show me." We crossed the access road together. A Seneca County deputy named Evelyn Stevenson met us at the edge of the gravel. She was shorter than Drew, maybe 5'5", with her hair pulled back tight and her hand resting on her duty belt. She nodded at me once, then looked at Drew. "We found their truck," she said. "It's parked by the old section house. No sign of them." Drew followed her down the access road. I followed Drew. The fog was starting to lift, but the grain siding still looked like something out of another decade. Rusted rails, collapsed loading dock, weeds growing through the ballast. The section house sat at the far end, a low brick building with boarded windows and a roof that sagged in the middle like a broken spine. The white high rail pickup was parked beside it. Drew circled the truck twice, photographing the doors, the bumper, the magnetic Norfolk Southern markings that looked slightly too large. He opened the driver's door with a gloved hand and leaned inside. When he straightened, he was holding a clipboard with a blank track authority form clipped to it. The form was old. The paper was yellow. The logo at the top was Norfolk Southern, but the formatting was wrong in a way I couldn't quite name. Evelyn stood beside the section house door. "It's open." Drew handed me the clipboard. "Stay here." I stayed. Drew and Evelyn went inside with their flashlights drawn. I could see their beams moving through the cracks in the boarded windows. I could hear their voices, low and careful, calling out rooms as they cleared them. The sun was starting to come up. The fog was burning off. The grain siding looked worse in daylight than it had in the dark. Evelyn came out first. Her face was set in a way that told me she had seen something she didn't want to talk about yet. Drew came out second. He looked at me, then looked at the truck, then looked back at the section house, like he was deciding how much to say. "There's blood inside," he said. "Fresh. And there are restraints bolted to the floor in the back room. Old ones. Railroad iron." I didn't ask what kind of restraints. I didn't ask how much blood. Evelyn called for backup over her radio. 2 more deputies arrived within 20 minutes. By dawn, the section house was taped off. I stood beside the access road with my torn coat and my grease-streaked vest and watched Drew and Evelyn supervise the scene. The sun came up clean and cold. The fog was gone. The grain siding looked like what it was, an abandoned piece of railroad infrastructure that nobody had used in 30 years. Then the deputies came out carrying something long wrapped in a blue tarp. I started to move closer. Drew raised one hand. "Write that you encountered unauthorized persons impersonating maintenance employees," he said. "Do not speculate beyond that." Evelyn looked at me. Her voice was quieter than Drew's. "There are old restraints bolted to the floorboards. Fresh blood in the section house. No matching injured person found." I watched the deputies carry the tarp to a county van. I didn't ask what was inside it. I didn't ask how fresh the blood was or what the restraints had been used for. Drew had already told me what I was allowed to write, and Evelyn had already told me what she was allowed to say. Drew walked over to where I was standing. "Colton, Tran, and Cole Bush. Those the names they gave you?" "Yes." "They don't match railroad records. They don't match DMV records. They don't match contractor rosters." He looked back at the section house. "But they had your train symbol. They had your stop location. They had your milepost. And they had something that sounded exactly like your dispatcher." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The 2 deputies carried the long blue-tarped object out of the section house and loaded it into the back of the van. Drew watched them close the doors. Evelyn stood beside the tape with her arms crossed. The sun was fully up now. The grain siding sat quiet and empty under a sky that looked like it had never seen fog. I stood beside the access road and tried to remember what Colton's smile had looked like before Denise's real voice came through. 3 weeks later, the sleet came down at an angle that made the yard lights blur into dirty halos. I stood beside the trailing unit with my collar turned up, breath fogging against the cold, while Mario checked the air pressure one more time. We were at a crew change point near Elkhart, Indiana, waiting for a van that dispatch said was running 40 minutes late. The locomotives idled behind us, their exhaust mixing with the sleet, and the ballast under my boots was already turning to a slick gray paste. Mario climbed down and shook his head. "Van's not coming anytime soon." "I know. We could wait in the lead unit." We could. Neither of us moved. Sometimes standing in bad weather felt better than sitting in a warm cab counting the minutes. The sleet hissed against the side of the cars. The yard was empty except for a string of tank cars on the adjacent track and a single maintenance truck parked near the signal house with its lights off. I was about to suggest we go inside anyway when I heard footsteps on gravel. A young man appeared beside the steps of the trailing unit. He wore black railroad rain gear that looked too big for him, muddy boots, and no hard hat. His hair was wet and plastered flat against his skull. He carried a canvas grip in one hand. "Help you?" I said. He looked at me, then at Mario, then back at me. "Transportation left me behind." His voice was quiet and thin, like he had been talking into the wind for hours. Mario stepped closer. "You with a crew?" "I was. Recrew mix-up. I'm deadheading to Fort Wayne." I studied his face. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with pale skin and gray eyes that did not blink much. His rain gear was zipped to the throat, and the canvas grip looked old, the kind with brass corner caps and a leather handle worn smooth. "What's your name?" "Zayden Olson." "You got paperwork?" "What's your name?" "Zayden Olson." "You got paperwork?" He shifted the grip to his other hand and pulled a folded packet from inside his coat. The paper was damp and smudged, but I could make out a train symbol and terminal names that were close enough to be plausible. Mario leaned over my shoulder and squinted at it. "That's the right district," Mario said. I handed the paperwork back. "Employee number?" Zayden gave me a string of digits in the right format. I did not have a way to verify it without calling dispatch, and calling dispatch to check a dead-heading brakeman who had already shown paperwork felt like the kind of thing that got a conductor written up for wasting radio time. Mario looked at me. I looked at the sleet coming down harder now, turning the yard into a wet gray blur. "All right," I said. "You can ride in the second unit until the next terminal." Zayden nodded once and climbed the steps without saying thank you. We followed him up. The second unit was colder than the lead, and the heater rattled when Mario turned it on. Zayden sat on the bench seat with his knees close together and the canvas grip between his boots. He did not take off his coat. He did not ask how long the trip would be. He just sat there with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor. Mario and I exchanged a look. Mario shrugged and went forward to check the radio. I stayed in the doorway for a moment, watching Zayden. The canvas grip smelled like iron and wet leaves, a smell that did not belong in a locomotive or on a railroader's equipment. I almost asked about it, but Zayden did not look like the kind of person who wanted conversation. When the van finally arrived and the new crew climbed aboard, we got the train moving again. I stayed in the lead unit with Mario, but I kept thinking about Zayden sitting alone in the second unit with that grip between his boots. An hour later, Mario called out a signal. "Clear." From the second unit, faint enough that I almost missed it, I heard Zayden's voice. "Clear." Mario glanced at me. "Did he just—" "Yeah." We came around a curve. Mario leaned forward. "Approach medium." This time I heard Zayden say it first, a whisper that came through the open door between the units before the signal mast was even visible. 30 seconds later, Mario's ditch lights caught the yellow over green exactly where Zayden had predicted it. Mario's hands tightened on the throttle. "How's he doing that?" "I don't know." The smell from the canvas grip was stronger now, or maybe I was just noticing it more. Iron and wet leaves and something else underneath. Something that reminded me of the section house near Fostoria. I stood and walked back to the second unit. Zayden was still sitting in the same position, knees together, grip between his boots. His eyes were open, but he was not looking at anything. "What's in the bag?" I said. He looked at me without blinking. "Company property is none of your business." His tone was flat, not defensive or angry, just empty. I waited for him to say something else, but he went back to staring at the floor. I returned to the lead unit and sat down. Mario gave me a questioning look. I shook my head. We were still 40 minutes from the terminal when the radio crackled. "Hotbox detector, milepost 184. Defect car symbol, November Sierra Charlie X 3275. Recommend inspection." Mario swore and began slowing the train. I grabbed my lantern and stepped into the second unit to tell Zayden we were making an unscheduled stop. He was already standing. "I know," he said. "How I'm going to take a leak. He picked up the canvas grip and walked past me before I could say anything else. By the time we came to a full stop outside Lima, Ohio, he was already down the steps and walking into the dark beyond the ditch lights. I called after him, but he did not turn around. Mario leaned out of the cab. Where's he going? Said he's taking a leak. With his bag? I did not have an answer for that. I walked the ballast to the car with the hotbox, found the defect, and called it in to dispatch. Denise Gray answered. Her voice was calm and precise. Copy. Set the car out at the next sighting and continue. Understood. I waited by the defective car for Zayden to come back. 5 minutes passed. 10. The sleet had stopped, but the air was still cold enough to sting my throat. I walked back to the second unit and climbed the steps. The canvas grip was gone. Zayden was gone. The only thing he had left behind was a faint smell of iron and wet leaves. Mario came back and looked at the empty seat. Where is he? Vanished. What do you mean, vanished? I mean, he walked off with his bag and did not come back. Mario stared at the seat, like Zayden might reappear if he waited long enough. Then he looked at me. We need to report this. I know. But when I bent down to check under the seat, my hand brushed something hard. I pulled it out. The canvas grip was there, shoved back against the wall, where it could not be seen unless you were looking for it. Mario stepped closer. I thought you said... He took it with him. I saw him take it. Mario did not argue. He just stared at the grip. I set it on the seat and unlatched the top. The smell hit me first, stronger now, iron and wet leaves and something rotten underneath. Inside were bolt cutters, a bloody switch key, a length of signal wire, and a dispatcher lineup printed on yellow paper. The paper was old, the kind Norfolk Southern had not used in more than a decade. Beneath those were photographs. I pulled them out one at a time. The first showed my train from an overpass near Fostoria. The second showed Mario walking the consist in Indiana. The third showed me asleep in the conductor's seat, taken from inside the cab. The last one showed me holding the canvas grip in both hands, standing under a sodium yard light, even though Mario had taken the bag from under the seat and I had not touched it yet. Mario's voice came out hoarse. Call Denise. I picked up the radio. My hands were shaking. Dispatch. This is eastbound NS 147. Denise answered immediately. Go ahead. 147. We need railroad police at the terminal. We've got evidence. There was a pause. What kind of evidence? The kind that proves we're being watched. Denise did not ask me to clarify. She just said she would make the call and told me to stay on the locomotive until Drew Palmer arrived. I sat with the canvas grip on my lap and the photographs spread across the seat. Mario stood in the doorway, looking out at the dark stretch of track where Zayden had disappeared. Neither of us spoke. The train idled. The radio hissed. The photographs stayed exactly where I had placed them. At the terminal, Drew Palmer took the grip into evidence. He wore a railroad police windbreaker and latex gloves, and he did not ask stupid questions. He photographed the contents, logged each item, and sealed the bag in a clear evidence pouch. When he was done, he looked at me. Do not go home alone. I'm not bringing this to my wife before I understand what it is. Eli, men play ugly games around railroads. You've got evidence now. Follow it. Drew's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. He took the grip and left. Mario and I finished the paperwork in silence. By the time I got in my truck and started the drive back to Bellevue, Ohio, the sky was turning gray with dawn. When I reached my house, I saw the rusted date nail first. It was driven into the porch rail, old and bent, the kind that track crews used to mark ties before the railroad switched to spray paint. Folded beneath it was a strip of paper. I pulled it free and held it up to the porch light. It was old Norfolk and Western timetable paper, yellowed at the edges, listing 3 train symbols. The first 2 I recognized from my call board. The third had not appeared yet. I stood there with the paper in my hand, looking at the date nail, looking at the empty street, looking at the dark windows of my house where Mackenzie was still asleep. The rusted date nail remained stuck in my porch rail above the old timetable strip, listing the train that had not yet appeared on the call board. The storm caught us 4 hours into the run, somewhere past the Virginia border and climbing toward Bluefield. Rain hammered the windshield hard enough that Mario had to slow the consist to 20 miles per hour just to read the signals through the glass. Lightning split the ridges on both sides of the cut, and the radio crackled with static every time the sky lit up. We were running close to our hours of service limit, and Mario knew it before I did. He glanced at his watch, then at me, and said we'd have to tie down soon or risk a violation. I checked the crew packet on my tablet. The system showed a rest point about 2 miles from the next siding, a Norfolk Southern bunkhouse near the old Pocahontas Division route. It was listed as available and close enough that we could walk instead of waiting 4 hours for a van that might not come in weather like this. Mario nodded and started breaking the train down. By the time we reached the siding and tied down, the rain had turned the ballast into mud and the sky into something solid and black. We grabbed our grips and stepped into the storm. The wind tore at my reflective vest, and water ran down the back of my neck before we made it 10 feet from the locomotive. Mario kept his head down and followed the beam of my lantern as we crossed the tracks and climbed the short embankment toward the trees. The bunkhouse was supposed to be just beyond the tree line, tucked against the hillside where the old division route used to run before Norfolk Southern consolidated the territory. We found it exactly where the map said it would be. It was a 2-story brick building with dark windows, a tin awning over the front steps, and 1 lantern burning beside the door. The light was yellow and steady, the kind that came from a flame instead of a bulb. The awning kept most of the rain off the porch, and the bricks looked dry enough that the building had been standing there a long time. I stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at Mario. He looked back at me, water dripping off the brim of his cap, and said nothing. The door opened before we knocked. An elderly man stood in the doorway, backlit by a dim hallway. He wore suspenders over a flannel shirt, and his face was lined deep enough that I couldn't guess his age in the poor light. He smelled faintly of coal smoke, the kind that clung to old stoves and wool blankets. He looked at us without surprise, as if he had been waiting, and said his name was Harold Blevins. Then he stepped aside and held the door open. We went in because the alternative was standing in the storm. The hallway was narrow and smelled like damp carpet and radiator heat. Harold closed the door behind us, latched it, and walked to a small desk near the stairs. He opened a drawer and pulled out 2 brass keys. The keys were old, stamped with numbers that didn't match any system Norfolk Southern used. I recognized the lettering on the key heads. They were Norfolk and Western Railway keys, from before the merger, before my time on the railroad. I asked Harold for a room facing the tracks. He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head and said the second floor had only 2 rooms available tonight, and both faced the hillside. He handed me a key stamped with the number 7, and gave Mario the one marked with an 8. Then he pointed up the stairs and said the washroom was at the end of the hall. We climbed the stairs, The carpet on the second floor was damp, and the air was warmer than it should have been. A radiator at the far end of the corridor ticked with heat that seemed too strong for the broken windows. I could see past it. Glass missing from the frames and rain blowing in across the sill. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked down the hall. The doors were all closed except for one at the very end, which hung open just enough to show darkness beyond it. Mario unlocked room 8 and went inside without looking back. I unlocked room 7 and pushed the door open. The room was small. 2 narrow beds sat against opposite walls, a dresser stood between them, and a closet door hung half open near the window. The window faced the hillside, just as Harold had said. I couldn't see anything beyond it except black trees and rain. I dropped my grip on the bed nearest the door and walked to the closet. Inside was an old signal relay cabinet, the kind that used to sit in tower bases before automation. It had been shoved into the closet at an angle, and the door hung loose on one hinge. I opened it. A severed hogshead sat on the bottom shelf, rough cut and still wet at the neck. I stepped back. The smell hit me a second later, sharp and metallic. I looked at the thing for a few more seconds, then closed the cabinet door and walked out of the room. Mario was standing in the hallway with his hand on his doorknob. He looked at me and asked what was wrong. I told him. He came into my room and looked at the hogshead himself. Then he looked at me and said we needed to leave. I pulled out my phone. No service. I tried the railroad radio. Static, distant, and empty, like the channel was open but no one was transmitting. I called for Denise twice, then a third time, and got nothing but the same flat noise. Mario stood by the window and looked out at the storm. The rain was coming down harder now, and the trees were bending under the wind. I asked him if he wanted to walk back to the locomotive. He looked at the rain, then at me, and said the train was tied down, and we'd already burned half our rest time getting here. If we went back now, we'd still be out of hours when the storm cleared, and dispatch would want to know why we hadn't used the listed rest point. I knew he was right. I also knew I didn't want to stay. We shoved the dresser against the door. It took both of us to move it, and the legs scraped against the floor loud enough that I worried someone downstairs would hear. When it was wedged tight, Mario sat on the bed nearest the window, and I sat on the one by the door. I kept my lantern on the dresser and put the railroad spike I'd picked up outside on the mattress beside me. Mario kept his grip within reach. We agreed to stay awake in shifts. Mario said he'd take the first one. I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers with my boots still on and listened to the rain hammer the window and the radiator tick in the hallway. The building was too quiet for a place with other people in it. I didn't hear footsteps, doors closing, water running, or voices. Just the storm and the radiator and the faint creak of old wood settling under weight. Near 3 a.m, someone tried the doorknob. It turned slowly, not like someone drunk or confused, but like someone testing whether resistance had been added. The knob stopped when it met the dresser. There was a pause. Then something flat and metal slid under the door. I sat up. Mario was already on his feet, the chair from the corner raised in both hands. The metal object scraped against the floor as it came through the gap, and I recognized it before it cleared the threshold. A conductor's punch. The old hand tool, the kind they used to mark tickets before my time, before scanners and tablets. It was flat steel with a spring hinge and a cutting edge shaped like a crescent. I'd seen them in railroad museums and estate sales, but never on a working train. The punch opened and closed twice. The sound was sharp and deliberate. like someone clipping the air to see if we were listening. Then the man outside the door whispered Mario's full name. Mario Morgan. Mario's knuckles went white around the chair legs. I grabbed the railroad spike and stood beside him, my lantern in my other hand. The light threw our shadows against the wall and made the room smaller than it was. The person in the hall didn't move. I could hear breathing now, slow and even, just on the other side of the door. We waited. The punch lay on the floor between the door and the dresser, half in shadow, its hinge still open. The breathing continued, then it stopped. The conductor's punch slid back under the door and disappeared into the hallway. The hallway went quiet. I waited until my breathing slowed, then looked at Mario. He was still holding the chair, his knuckles white around the backrest. Neither of us spoke. The radiator ticked. Rain hammered the windows. Somewhere below us, a door creaked open and closed, but no footsteps followed. We stayed awake until dawn. When gray light finally bled through the broken windows at the end of the corridor, I shoved the dresser away from the door and stepped into the hall. The carpet was still damp. The conductor's punch was gone. No mud tracked the floor. No one stood waiting at the stairs. Mario followed me down to the front desk. Harold was gone. The desk was empty. The ledger we had signed lay open to a blank page. The lantern that had been burning beside the door was cold, its wick black and dry. I checked the back office. No coat hung on the peg. No coffee sat warming on the hot plate. The whole building felt like a place that had been abandoned in the middle of a shift. Outside, the rain had turned the yard to mud. I stepped off the porch and looked for tire tracks. There were none. No ruts led to the road. No vehicle had come or gone during the night. The only marks in the mud were our boot prints from the evening before, already softening under the drizzle. Mario came down the steps behind me, his grip slung over one shoulder. "Let's get back to the train," he said. We walked the ballast in silence. The storm had passed, but the clouds sat low enough to turn the hills into gray shapes without edges. By the time we reached the siding, my boots were caked with mud and my coat was soaked through. The locomotive sat where we had left it, ditch lights still burning, but something about the consist looked wrong. I climbed the steps and checked the paperwork Mario had left on the seat. The updated consist sheet had come through overnight, printed remotely and fed into the cab printer while we slept. I scanned the car list. 3 intermodal containers near the rear of the train were flagged with inspection notes I had not written. Mario leaned over my shoulder and read the entries aloud. "Seal intact, door ajar. Seal intact, door ajar. Seal intact, door ajar." I looked at him. "We didn't open those," I said. "I know." We walked the train together. The first container was a 40-foot box with a yard seal still crimped around the locking bar. The door was open 6 inches. Inside were pallets of shrink-wrapped electronics, undisturbed. The second container held furniture. The third held bagged grain. None of the seals were broken. None of the doors showed pry marks. They had been opened from the inside. Mario pulled his grease pencil from behind his ear and marked each car number on the back of his hand. "Check the 4th one," he said. I found the entry halfway down the updated consist. A covered hopper that should have been mid-train was listed as set out on Pocahontas Siding 4. I pulled my track chart from my grip and unfolded it across the locomotive desk. Mario traced the route with one finger. We checked every branch, every spur, every named siding between Bluefield and the next terminal. There was no Pocahontas Siding 4. I called Denise. The radio crackled twice before her voice came through, sharp and clear. "Go ahead." "Denise, this is Eli. We've got a consist issue. Updated paperwork shows a car set out on Pocahontas Sighting 4. Can you confirm that location? The line went quiet for long enough that I thought I had lost her. Then she came back. Negative. That set out instruction did not come from dispatch. Mario leaned closer to the handset. Denise, can you verify the bunkhouse we stayed at last night? The one listed in our crew packet near the old Pocahontas division route. Another pause. Stand by. I heard keys clicking in the background, then the faint sound of a phone ringing somewhere in the Atlanta dispatch center. Denise came back on, and her voice had lost its usual steadiness. There is no current Norfolk Southern property database listing for that bunkhouse. Mario looked at me. We were just there, I said into the handset. I believe you, Denise said. But according to my system, that property does not exist. I set the handset down and stared at the updated consist sheet. The set-out instruction was printed in the same format as every other entry. The car number matched our train. The milepost reference was precise, but the siding it named had never been built, and the bunkhouse we had slept in was not supposed to be standing. Mario rubbed his face with both hands. Call Palmer, he said. Drew arrived 2 hours later with a Morgan County Sheriff's deputy named Alan Pruitt. They met us at the siding in separate vehicles, both men stepping out into the mud with the cautious movements of people who had been briefed but did not yet believe the briefing. Drew wore his railroad police windbreaker and carried a camera bag over one shoulder. Alan wore a brown deputy's uniform and kept one hand near his duty belt as he walked the ballast toward us. Drew shook my hand, then Mario's. Show me, he said. We took them to the opened containers first. Drew photographed the intact seals and the ajar doors. Alan crouched beside the third container and ran his flashlight beam along the locking bar. No tool marks, he said. No forced entry. Drew made notes in a small spiral pad, then looked at me. You said the bunkhouse was near here. I nodded. About a quarter-mile west, we can walk it. We followed the access road back toward the location marked on the crew packet map. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft, and the air smelled like wet leaves and diesel exhaust. Mario walked beside me without speaking. Drew and Alan followed a few steps behind, their boots squelching in the mud. When we reached the clearing where the bunkhouse had stood, I stopped. It was gone. In its place was a burned foundation half swallowed by weeds and cinders. The brick walls had collapsed inward, leaving only jagged sections of blackened masonry rising a few feet above the ground. The tin awning was gone. The porch was gone. The lantern that had burned beside the door was gone. What remained looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Mario stepped forward, then stopped at the edge of the ash. That's not possible, he said. Alan walked the perimeter of the foundation, his flashlight sweeping the ground. Drew moved more slowly, photographing the site from multiple angles before stepping over the low remains of the front wall. I stayed where I was, staring at the place where the front desk should have been. Alan came back carrying a clipboard. I pulled county records on the way here, he said. This property burned in 1983. One fatality. Caretaker named Harold Blevins. Mario turned to look at me. I said nothing. Drew crouched in the center of the foundation, brushing ash away from something near what would have been the stairwell. He pulled a small evidence bag from his pocket and used a pen to lift the object free. When he held it up, I recognized the shape immediately. It was my brass room key. The number stamped into the metal was the same number Harold had given me the night before. Drew turned it over in the light, then looked at me. This was in the ash, he said. I nodded. He handed it to me last night. I left it on the desk when we checked out this morning. Drew sealed the key in the evidence bag and stood. Alan was still walking the perimeter, his flashlight aimed at the ground near the edge of the foundation. He stopped beside a charred concrete step and waved Drew over. "Blood," Alan said. "Fresh." Drew photographed the step, then crouched beside it. The stain was dark and still wet despite the rain. Alan knelt on the other side and aimed his flashlight lower, tracing a line of prints that crossed the ash toward the track. "Footprints," Alan said. "Human. Recent." Drew followed the prints with his camera, documenting each one until they disappeared into the weeds near the ballast. He straightened and looked back at the foundation, then at me. "You said you stayed here last night." Yes. "In a room on the second floor." "Yes." He gestured at the collapsed walls. "There's no second floor." Mario stepped closer, his voice tight. "We were here. Both of us. We signed the ledger. We saw Harold. We slept in that room." Alan looked at Drew. "What do you want me to put in the report?" Drew was quiet for a long moment. He held the evidence bag up to the light, studying the brass key through the plastic. Then he lowered it and met my eyes. "Cargo tampering by unknown persons at or near an undocumented structure," he said. Alan frowned. "That's not what happened. That's what the report will say." Drew turned and walked back toward the vehicles, the evidence bag in one hand and his camera in the other. Alan followed, shaking his head. Mario stood beside me at the edge of the ash, staring at the place where the front door should have been. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called Mackenzie. She answered on the second ring. "Eli?" "I'm okay," I said. "Where are you?" "West Virginia, near Bluefield." There was a pause. "Are you coming home?" I looked at the burned foundation, at the brass key in Drew's hand, at the footprints crossing the ash toward the track. "Soon," I said. "Eli, what happened?" I closed my eyes. I stayed in a building that burned down 40 years ago. Another pause, longer this time. "I don't understand." "Neither do I." She was quiet. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line, steady and deliberate, the way she breathed when she was trying not to cry. "This isn't men playing games anymore, is it?" she said. "No." "Then come home." "I will." "When?" I opened my eyes and looked at Mario. He was still staring at the foundation, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "After we finish the trip," I said. Mackenzie hung up. I put the phone away and walked back to where Drew stood beside his vehicle. He was labeling the evidence bag with a marker, his movements precise and methodical. When he saw me, he held the bag up so I could see the key through the plastic. "This was in the ash," he said again. "I know. But you carried it last night." "Yes." He lowered the bag. "That's not how objects work, Eli." "I know." Drew sealed the bag in his evidence kit and closed the lid. Alan was already in his patrol car, writing his report on a laptop mounted to the dash. Mario stood alone near the foundation, his back to all of us. Drew looked at me. "The final report will document the breached containers and the impossible car listing. It will reference an undocumented structure. It will not attempt to explain how a building that burned in 1983 handed you a key that I just pulled from the same fire." "Understood." He opened his vehicle door, then paused. "Do you believe it was real?" he asked. "Yes. Even though it's gone now." "Yes." Drew nodded slowly. "Then be careful which buildings you walk into next time." He climbed into his vehicle and drove away. Alan followed a moment later, his patrol car kicking up mud as it turned onto the access road. Mario walked back to where I stood and looked at the foundation one last time. "We slept there," he said. "I know." "We saw Harold." "I know." He turned and started walking toward the train. "I'm not telling anyone that," he said. I followed him back to the locomotive. We climbed into the cab, secured the doors, and waited for dispatch to give us authority to move. The radio was quiet. The PTC screen showed our position on the siding, a small green icon surrounded by empty track. Mario sat in the engineer's seat with his hands folded in his lap. After a long silence, he spoke without looking at me. "What if it happens again?" I stared out the windshield at the ballast, the weeds, the distant burned foundation barely visible through the trees. "Then we write it down," I said. "And we don't go inside." Mario nodded. The radio crackled. Denise's voice came through, calm and steady. "Authority issued. You are clear to proceed." Mario started the engine. The locomotive rumbled to life beneath us. I picked up the handset and confirmed the authority, my voice flat and professional. Then I set the handset down and watched the burned foundation disappear behind us as the train began to move. Across the clearing, at the edge of the ash, Drew stood alone. He held my brass room key above the burned foundation. Mario had been on medical leave for 3 weeks when I took the eastbound with Martin Calhoun. Martin was a good engineer, steady on the throttle and careful with his brake applications, but he was not Mario. He did not mark unexpected stops on the back of his paperwork. He did not keep a grease pencil behind his ear. He talked less, and when he did talk, it was about tonnage and fuel consumption instead of the small warnings that kept men alive on bad nights. We were climbing the mountain approach near Clifton Forge, Virginia, when the headlight caught something between the rails. At first, I thought it was debris from a rock slide or a torn tarp blown down from a passing intermodal. Then the shape resolved into limbs, a torso, a duffel bag lying beside it, a body. Martin saw it at the same moment I did and dumped the air without a word. The brakes grabbed hard, and I was already reaching for my lantern and emergency kit before the train stopped rocking. I keyed the radio. "Denise, this is Conductor Sawyer on eastbound Q301. We've got an emergency stop at milepost 214.6. There's a person on the track." Her voice came back clean and sharp. "Copy, Elliot. Is the person moving?" "Negative. I'm going down now." I grabbed my lantern, clipped my radio to my vest, and stepped down into the cold. The air smelled like wet stone and diesel exhaust. The headlight cut a white cone through the darkness, and at the far edge of that cone, the man lay motionless between the rails. I walked the ballast with my lantern raised, calling out as I went. "Can you hear me? I'm coming to help." No answer. The duffel bag was canvas, dark with moisture or something worse. The man's coat was torn open at the shoulder. One of his shoes was missing. When I reached him, I knelt and set the lantern on the ballast beside his head. He was alive. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Blood ran from his nose and mouth, and his face was swollen on one side where someone had beaten him badly. I pulled my gloves off and checked his pulse. It was there, but weak. "Can you hear me?" I said again. His eyes opened. They were wide and glassy, unfocused in the lantern light. He grabbed my sleeve with one hand, his fingers cold and slick with blood. "Track 19, he whispered. I leaned closer. "What?" "Track 19. "What?" "Track 19. There was no track 19 on this line. There was mainline, sidings, and a short industrial spur near the terminal, but no track 19. I opened my mouth to ask his name, to ask what he meant, to ask where he was hurt. Then the rifles cracked. The first shot hit the ballast 3 feet from my boot, throwing gravel and sparks. The second hit the locomotive handrail with a bright metallic clang. I dropped flat and rolled toward the ditch as more shots followed, coming from both sides of the cut. Martin was shouting from the cab, but I could not hear the words over the gunfire. 2 men rushed the lead unit steps from the darkness, their faces covered with bandanas. A pickup truck swung across the nearest grade crossing with its headlights off, blocking the access road. I crawled under the locomotive walkway, my back pressed against the cold undercarriage, and keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Denise, shots fired. We are under attack." Her voice came back instantly, no hesitation, no question. "Copy, Elliot. Stay down. Help is coming." One of the men reached the cab steps. I heard Martin curse, then a heavy thud and a sharp cry. The man fell backward off the steps and hit the ballast hard. Martin slammed the cab door, and the lock engaged with a solid click. Another shot broke my lantern. The bulb exploded in a spray of glass, and the light died. I pressed myself tighter against the walkway and tried to slow my breathing. The injured man was still lying between the rails. He had not moved. I could see his chest rising and falling in the faint glow from the locomotive ditch lights, but his eyes were closed now, and his hand had fallen away from my sleeve. Footsteps crunched on the ballast. Someone was moving along the right side of the train, slow and deliberate. I held my breath and watched the shadows shift under the locomotive frame. Then I heard sirens. The footsteps stopped. A voice shouted something I could not make out, and the pickup truck's engine roared. Tires spun on gravel, and the truck pulled away from the crossing. The men near the locomotive scattered into the trees. The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights swept across the cut, and 2 vehicles came down the access road fast enough to throw dust. A Virginia State Police cruiser stopped near the locomotive, and an Allegheny County Sheriff's Department SUV pulled up behind it. Doors opened. A woman in a trooper's uniform stepped out with her weapon drawn, and a deputy followed her, moving low and scanning the tree line. I crawled out from under the walkway and raised my hands. "Conductor Sawyer." The attackers went into the trees. The trooper nodded and lowered her weapon slightly. "Rebecca Haynes, Virginia State Police. Are you injured?" "No, but there's a man on the track. He needs an ambulance." She moved past me toward the injured man, while the deputy, a younger man with a square jaw and a careful stride, checked the area near the locomotive. He found one of the attackers lying unconscious in the ditch, his jaw swollen and twisted at an ugly angle. "This one's breathing," the deputy called out. "Looks like someone kicked him in the face." Martin opened the cab door and leaned out, breathing hard. He tried to climb inside. I wasn't letting him. Rebecca knelt beside the injured man on the track and checked his pulse. She looked up at me, and I saw the answer in her face before she said it. "He's gone." I stood there with my hands still raised, my vest torn, my lantern broken, and the man who had whispered, "Track 19," lying dead between the rails. The deputy walked over to the duffel bag and crouched beside it. He pulled on gloves, unzipped the bag, and went still. "Trooper Haynes," he said quietly. Rebecca stood and joined him. She looked into the bag, then at me, then back at the bag. "What is it?" I asked. She did not answer right away. Instead, she pulled out her flashlight and shone it into the duffel. I saw cash banded in bank wrappers, stacks of it, more than I had ever seen outside a movie. Beneath the cash were 2 handheld radios, both smeared with blood, and beneath those, was a piece of yellow paper, folded once. Rebecca unfolded the paper carefully. It was a switch list, the kind yardmasters use to organize consists. My locomotive number was circled in red ink. "Deputy Ivy," Rebecca said, "secure this scene. No one touches anything until the detectives get here." Thomas Ivy nodded and began stringing crime scene tape from the locomotive to the nearest milepost. Rebecca turned to me. "Mr. Sawyer, I need you to tell me everything that happened from the moment you saw this man on the track." I told her. I told her about the body, the duffel, the whispered words, the rifle shots, the men rushing the locomotive, Martin's kick, the pickup truck. I told her about the radio call I had made to Denise Gray and the help she had sent. I told her I did not know the injured man's name, did not know why he had been lying on the track, did not know why someone wanted him dead, or why they had my locomotive number. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wrote something in a small notebook, then looked at Thomas. "Run the prints on the unconscious one," she said, "and get an ID on the deceased." Thomas nodded and walked back to his SUV. Rebecca turned to the duffel bag and crouched beside it again. She picked up one of the bloody handheld radios and turned it over in her gloved hand. "This is a railroad frequency radio," she said. "Yes." "Why would a drug courier have one?" I did not have an answer for that. She set the radio down and reached for the second one. As her fingers closed around it, the radio crackled. Static hissed through the speaker. Then a voice came through, calm and precise, using proper railroad cadence. "Q301, this is dispatch. You are cleared to proceed at restricted speed to the next control point. Acknowledge." I went cold. It was Denise's voice. Rebecca looked at me. "Is that your dispatcher?" I keyed my own radio with hands that would not stop shaking. "Denise, did you just transmit a proceed order?" There was a pause. Then Denise came back on my radio, her voice tight with confusion. "Negative, Elliot. I have not transmitted anything since your emergency call. What's going on?" The bloody radio in Rebecca's hand crackled again, and Denise's voice repeated the same message, word for word, with the same cadence, the same pauses, the same inflection. "Q301, this is dispatch. You are cleared to proceed at restricted speed to the next control point. Acknowledge." Rebecca dropped the radio like it had burned her. It landed on the ballast beside the duffel bag, and Denise's voice kept speaking. "After Clifton Forge, I changed. Not all at once, but the way a signal aspect changes when the relay throws. One position to another with no middle ground. I started photographing seals before departure. Every intermodal container, every boxcar latch, every mechanical reefer door that should have been locked. I kept the photos on my phone in dated folders and backed them up to a cloud drive Mackenzie had set up for vacation pictures we no longer took. Other conductors saw me doing it in the yard and looked away like I was counting ties or talking to myself. I checked locomotive cabinets, the electrical panels, the tool lockers, the nose compartment where the emergency gear lived. I opened them, shined my light inside, and closed them again even when nothing had changed since the last terminal. Martin Calhoun asked me once what I was looking for. I told him I was making sure everything that should be there was there, and that everything that shouldn't be there wasn't. He nodded, but he stopped riding in the same unit with me after that. I walked cars even when yard crews swore they had already done it. I went down the train with my lantern and checked every knuckle, every brake rod, every angle cock, every coupler pin. I looked under the cars. I looked between them. I looked for anything that didn't belong. Tools, bags, blood, keys, photographs. Crews started refusing to work with me. Dispatchers started assigning me to trains nobody wanted. I didn't care. I had stopped trusting systems that couldn't explain why a bunkhouse burned down 40 years before I walked into it, or why a duffel full of cash knew my locomotive number before I did. One night in June, I heard tapping. We were near Portsmouth, Ohio, taking a mixed consist east toward Williamson Yard. It was just after 11. The air was thick and still, the kind of night where sound carried strange and every rail joint echoed twice. I was doing my inspection at a division point, walking the train with my lantern, while the yard crew topped off the air and Martin brought up the new paperwork in the lead unit. The tapping came from a refrigerated boxcar 40 cars back. 2 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Pause. 3 taps. Then silence. I stopped walking. The reefer was listed empty on the consist, bad ordered for a failed cooling unit. The placard said it was being dead-headed back to a repair facility in Charleston. The door seal was intact. The refrigeration unit on the roof was dark and quiet. I raised my lantern and tapped the side of the car twice with the steel handle. 2 taps came back. I tapped once. 1 tap answered. I tapped 3 times. 3 taps replied, clean and deliberate, like someone counting off a signal code. I stepped back from the car. My hand found the radio on my belt, but I didn't key it yet. I needed to be sure. I walked around to the other side of the boxcar and tapped the wall again. Slower this time, testing whether the sound was mechanical. Something loose in the frame, a bracket rattling, a piece of cargo shifting even though the car was supposed to be empty. 2 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Pause. 3 taps. The same rhythm. The same spacing. Answering me. I keyed the radio. Denise, this is Eli Sawyer, conductor on NS 274 eastbound at Portsmouth. Static rolled through the first few seconds. Then her voice came back sharp and clear. Go ahead, Eli. I need railroad police and county law enforcement to meet me at the next accessible siding east of here. I've got a bad ordered reefer on the consist that shouldn't have anything inside it. And I'm hearing someone or something tapping from the interior. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough that I knew she was deciding whether to ask me if I was sure or just trust that I wouldn't call unless I was. Copy. Stand by. I stayed beside the boxcar with my lantern raised and my back to the ballast, so I could see both ends of the train. The tapping didn't come again. The refrigeration unit stayed dark. The seal stayed intact. But I could feel it now. The same pressure I'd felt in the bunkhouse hallway and on the ballast at Clifton Forge. Something waiting on the other side of a surface I couldn't see through. Denise came back on the radio. Eli, I've got Special Agent Drew Palmer and Scioto County Deputy Jenna Malik en route to Siding 3 east of your location. You're authorized to proceed at restricted speed and meet them there. Do not open that car until they arrive. Copy. Restricted speed to Siding 3. I won't touch it. Martin brought the train up slow. I rode in the second unit so I could keep the reefer in sight through the side window. It sat quiet in the consist. Just another bad-ordered car being moved to a repair point, except I could still hear the tapping in my head, even though the sound had stopped. We reached Siding 3 40 minutes later. Drew's unmarked Tahoe was already parked on the gravel access road beside the track, and Jenna's county unit sat behind it with the light bar off. I saw them standing together near the road crossing, both wearing vests, both carrying long flashlights. Drew had his service weapon on his belt. Jenna had hers in her hand. I climbed down and met them at the ballast. Which car? Drew asked. I pointed. 40 back, refrigerated boxcar, Bad order, listed empty. I heard tapping from inside, and it answered my lantern signals in code. Jenna looked at Drew. Drew looked at me. You're sure it answered? I'm sure. He nodded once, then pulled a camera from his vest and started walking. Jenna followed, and I came last with my lantern. We reached the reefer and stopped in front of the door. The seal was still intact. The placards were correct. The cooling unit was still dark. Nothing about the car looked wrong except that I had heard something inside it that shouldn't have been there. Drew photographed the seal, then cut it with a knife and dropped the pieces into an evidence bag. Jenna raised her thermal camera and aimed it at the door seam. She watched the screen for 10 seconds, then shook her head. No heat signature. Check it again after we open it, Drew said. He holstered his camera and drew his weapon. Jenna kept hers in her right hand and held the thermal unit in her left. I set my lantern on the ballast and gripped the reefer latch with both hands. On 3, Drew said. I counted. 1, 2, 3. I pulled the latch and shoved the door. It slid open 6 inches and stopped. A pale figure crouched among frost and hanging meat hooks, its hands folded backward against the floor like a man praying in reverse. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. Its head was down, and its hair hung forward, dark and wet. I couldn't see its face. I couldn't see its clothes. I could only see the shape of it, hunched and wrong, and the frost rising in thin clouds around its body. Jenna shouted. Drew grabbed the door handle and pulled it the rest of the way open. The car was empty. No figure. No frost clouds. No wet hair. No hands folded backward. Just an empty refrigerated boxcar with the cooling unit off and the interior temperature only a few degrees colder than the air outside. I stepped up onto the threshold and shined my light across the floor. No footprints. No marks. No blood. No water from melted frost. The floor was dry and clean, except for a thin layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed. Jenna raised the thermal camera again and swept it across the interior. Nothing. No residual heat, no cold spots, no movement. Drew climbed into the car and walked to the far end, checking the corners, the walls, the ceiling. I stayed on the threshold and kept my light on the floor, looking for anything that would prove I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. Then I saw the scratches. They were on the interior wall near the door, just above my eye level. Someone had used something sharp, maybe a nail, maybe a piece of broken metal, to gouge lines into the frost that still clung to the insulation in thin patches. The lines formed a crude signal mast with 2 heads, one above the other. The top head showed a clear aspect. The lower head was dark. Below the mast, gouged backward into the insulation so the letters read correctly from outside the car, was a name. Elliot Harrow. I stared at it. The letters were rough and uneven, carved deep enough that I could see the yellow insulation beneath the frost. The name was wrong. My name is Eli Sawyer, not Elliot Harrow, but it was close enough that my chest tightened and my hands went cold. Drew came back and stood beside me. He looked at the scratches, then at me. Who's Elliot Harrow? I don't know. You ever used that name? Ever had a railroad ID with that name? Ever heard someone call you that? No. He pulled his camera and photographed the wall. Jenna climbed into the car and checked the door frame, the latch mechanism, and the seal housing, looking for any sign that the door had been opened and resealed before we arrived. She didn't find anything. There's no way in or out except this door, she said. No vents big enough for a person, no roof hatch, no floor access. If someone was in here, they came through this door, and they would have broken the seal to do it. Drew finished photographing and stepped down. He looked at me again, and I could see him deciding what to write in his report. You saw someone inside when the door opened. Yes. Describe it. Pale, crouched, hands folded backward against the floor, head down, dark wet hair. I couldn't see the face. How long did you see it? 3 seconds, maybe 4. And when I opened the door the rest of the way, it was gone. Yes. He nodded slowly, then looked at Jenna. You saw it? I saw movement, Jenna said. Something low and fast. But when the door opened all the way, there was nothing there. Drew wrote something in his notebook, then closed it and looked back at me. Eli, I'm going to put this in the report as a possible trespasser incident with insufficient evidence to confirm occupancy. I'm going to note the scratches, the name, and the signal drawing. I'm going to note that you and Deputy Malik observed a movement that could not be verified upon full inspection. I'm not going to write that you saw a figure that disappeared, because that's not something I can document. I understood. He was giving me the cleanest version of the truth that would survive in a file someone else might read. What about the tapping? I'll note that you reported hearing tapping and that the sound corresponded to signal codes. I'll note that no source for the sound was found during inspection. And the name? He looked at the scratches again. I'll run it. If Elliot Harrow is someone with a railroad history, I'll find it. If it's not, then it's just a name someone carved into a boxcar for reasons we don't understand. He took one more photograph, then sealed the car with a new railroad police evidence tag and told me the reefer would be pulled from the consist at the next yard and held for further inspection. Jenna walked me back to the locomotive and waited until I climbed into the cab before she returned to her unit. Drew stayed beside the boxcar until we pulled away. I didn't tell Martin what I'd seen. I told him the car had been inspected and cleared, and that we were authorized to continue. He didn't ask what had been inside. He just nodded and brought the throttle up, and we finished the run without talking. Weeks later, I heard the tapping again. We were on a different train outside Muncie, Indiana, taking a westbound manifest toward Indianapolis. It was still dark, maybe an hour before sunrise. Mario hadn't come back to work yet. I was riding with Martin again, and we were in the trailing locomotive because the lead unit's cab heater had failed and neither of us wanted to freeze for 6 hours. The tapping started just after we cleared a grade crossing east of Muncie. 2 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Pause. 3 taps. It came from behind me, inside a sealed electrical cabinet mounted on the wall between the conductor's seat and the rear door. I turned and stared at the cabinet. The tapping stopped. I waited. It started again. Same rhythm, same spacing. Martin was in the engineer's seat with his back to me. I watched him for a few seconds, trying to see if he heard it. He didn't move. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the track ahead and his hand on the throttle. I keyed my radio and called his name on the intra-train channel. Martin, you hearing that? He didn't answer right away. The tapping continued, soft but deliberate, metal on metal, coming from inside a cabinet that should have been empty except for fuses and relay switches. Martin. He finally turned his head halfway, not looking at me, just far enough that I knew he'd heard me. Hearing what? The tapping from the cabinet. He looked at the windshield again. I hear something settling. That was all he said. Something settling. Not tapping. Not code. Not anything that required him to acknowledge what was happening behind him in a sealed cabinet on a train moving through the dark. I understood. Martin wasn't going to treat this as an incident. He wasn't going to call it in. He wasn't going to help me open the cabinet or stand beside me while I did. He was going to keep his eyes forward and finish the run and pretend he hadn't heard anything except the normal sounds a locomotive makes when it's pulling tonnage through the night. I didn't blame him. After everything that had happened, I wouldn't have wanted to work with me either. The tapping stopped again. I sat in the conductor's seat and stared at the cabinet latch. It was a simple mechanical latch, the kind you could open with one hand. I'd opened cabinets like it 1,000 times. There was nothing inside that could hurt me, just electrical components, fuses, maybe a spare radio battery. Nothing that could tap in code, nothing that could answer a lantern, nothing that could crouch in frost or carve a name backward into insulation. I put my hand on the latch. The tapping started again, louder this time, faster, like something inside was trying to get out or trying to warn me not to let it out. I didn't know which. I didn't know if opening the cabinet would end this or make it worse. I didn't know if I'd see something crouched inside or if the cabinet would be empty and I'd have to explain to Martin why I'd called in another incident that left no evidence. I kept my hand on the latch. The tapping continued. I didn't open it. I didn't let go. I just sat there with my palm pressed against the cold metal, feeling the vibration of the train through the floor and the rhythm of the tapping through the cabinet door. The sky began to lighten. The tapping slowed. By the time the sun broke the horizon and filled the cab with pale orange light, the sound had stopped. I still had my hand on the latch. Martin glanced back once, saw me sitting there, and turned forward again without saying anything. I didn't open the cabinet. I sat with my hand on it until we reached the yard, and then I climbed down and walked away while Martin handled the paperwork. I didn't write it up. I didn't call Drew. I didn't tell Denise. I just went home and stared at the ceiling and tried to decide whether not opening the cabinet had saved me from seeing something I couldn't unsee, or whether it proved I was too afraid to do the job anymore. I still don't know. Mario came back in October because he said he owed me the finish, whatever finish was coming. Light duty meant he could run the throttle but not walk consists or inspect track. That was fine. I would do the walking. We had both been on leave long enough that the railroad expected us to quit or transfer. We did not do either. We marked up for a westbound mountain run through the Allegheny Tunnel area in Pennsylvania, the kind of trip that required tonnage calculations, grade rules, and two men who trusted each other when the radio went quiet. The grade tightened just after sunset. Mario kept us crawling at restricted speed while I watched the signals and the mileposts. The track chart sat open on my lap. We had cleared the last block 20 minutes earlier. The positive train control screen should have updated by now. It had not. The display showed a block we no longer occupied and a speed limit that no longer applied. Mario tapped the screen twice. Nothing changed. "Check your phone," I said. He pulled it from his vest pocket, looked at it, and shook his head. "No service." I tried mine. Same result. The radio sat quiet on the console. I reached for the handset and pressed the transmit key. "Dispatch. This is westbound on the mountain approach. Radio check." Static answered. I tried again. More static. Mario glanced at me, but said nothing. We had both worked radio shadows before. This stretch had always been marginal, but we had never lost everything at once. The next signal came into view around the curve. It displayed a clear aspect, green over nothing, proceed at authorized speed. Mario eased off the independent brake and let the train roll forward. I looked at the track chart again. The signal should have been approach medium at best. We were hauling 86 cars up a grade with a speed restriction and a tunnel ahead. A clear aspect made no sense. "That signal's wrong," I said. "I see it." "Check the next one." We crawled forward. The next mast appeared beyond a cut in the hillside. Another clear aspect, then another. Every signal between us and the tunnel mouth displayed green over nothing, as if the entire mountain had been cleared for us, and no other train existed. The radio crackled. A voice came through, calm and precise, using the cadence I had heard 100 times. "Authority into siding 19 to meet an eastbound." Mario's hand went to the handset. I caught his wrist. "That's not Denise," I said. "It sounded like her." "It's not her." I pulled the track chart closer and ran my finger down the list of sidings, crossovers, and meets between our current milepost and the tunnel. There was no siding 19. There was mainline, tunnel bore, and a ravine that dropped 200 feet beyond the ballast on the north side. I showed Mario the chart. He looked at it, then at the radio, then back at me. "What do we do?" "We don't line ourselves into a siding that doesn't exist." The engine shuddered. Not a brake application, not a coupler slack adjustment, but a pull from behind, as if something had hooked the rear of the consist and was dragging against our forward momentum. Mario opened the throttle another notch. The sanders kicked in. The wheels bit into the rail. The pull did not stop. "Eli." "I know." I grabbed my lantern and a handful of fusees from the emergency kit. Mario kept both hands on the controls while I climbed down the steps into the cold. The grade pressed against my boots as I walked forward past the lead truck. The headlight cut through the dark ahead, illuminating ballast, rail, and the mouth of the real tunnel maybe 300 yards up the line. To the left of the tunnel, cut into the hillside where no bore should be, was another opening, darker, older, unlisted on every chart I had ever studied. A figure stood between the rails at the mouth of that bore. I stopped walking. My lantern beam did not reach it, but the locomotive ditch lights did. At first, I thought it was a man in torn maintenance gear, maybe a trespasser who had wandered onto the track. Then it turned. It was too tall. Its joints bent at angles that did not match a human frame. Scraps of reflective vest hung from its shoulders and torso, some orange, some yellow, all shredded. Where its eyes should have been were old signal lenses, one green and one red, catching the locomotive light and throwing it back in flat colors that did not blink. Its arms hung almost to the ballast. Around its chest were pieces of orange fabric, broken radio cord, and brass room keys tied on wire that clinked faintly in the wind. It did not stumble. It did not sniff the air like an animal. It waited. It had waited until the radio died, until the positive train control froze, until the cell service dropped, until every signal ahead lied, until the track chart failed to show the siding it had been told to take. It had waited until we were alone on the grade with no dispatcher, no map, no system, and no way to call for help. Then it charged. I dropped the fusees. My boot slipped on the ballast as I turned and ran for the locomotive. Behind me, I heard the scrape of something moving fast over gravel and rail. Not footsteps, but a dragging rush that did not slow for the grade. Mario saw my face through the windshield and threw the cab door open before I reached the steps. I caught the handrail with both hands and pulled myself up while the thing closed the distance behind me. Mario slammed the throttle forward. The sanders screamed. The independent brake released. The train lurched, wheels biting into the rail, and I felt something strike the rear grab iron hard enough to bend it inward. The metal shrieked. I pulled myself into the cab, and Mario yanked the door shut behind me. He did not ask what I had seen. He kept the throttle wide, and the sanders running while the train fought the grade and the pull from behind. We did not speak until the radio came back. It took miles. The positive train control screen unfroze somewhere past the real tunnel. Mario's phone found a signal near the next siding. When Denise's voice finally came through the speaker, clear and sharp and real, Mario kept both hands on the controls while her denial filled the cab. Negative. No meat order was issued. No authority into siding 19. I have not transmitted to your train since you entered the pass. In the live radio pocket beyond the pass, Mario Morgan keeps both hands on the controls, while Denise Gray's denial comes through the speaker. I finished the trip because freight trains did not disappear, just because the men inside them wanted to quit. Mario kept us crawling west through the next two radio pockets, Sanders dumping grit every time the wheels threatened to slip on the grade. Neither of us spoke. The positive train control screen came back online near Gallitzin and showed us exactly where we had always been. Main line, no sightings, no meets, no authority except the one Denise had given us before we entered the dead stretch. At the terminal, I stepped down with my legs shaking and my coat torn where I had caught the handrail. The grab iron on the trailing unit hung bent inward, metal twisted like someone had gripped it with both hands and pulled. Drew Palmer was waiting beside the yard office with his camera already out. He photographed the damage from 4 angles. He measured the bend. He scraped samples from the step well into evidence bags, melted plastic that had dripped across the grating in thin black strings. I watched him work under the sodium lights while Mario sat in the cab with the door open, staring at nothing. "What component uses this?" Drew asked, holding up one of the bags. I looked at the melted residue. It was not orange like a fusee. It was not yellow like reflective vest material. It was not any color I recognized from locomotive parts or railroad safety gear. "None," I said. Drew sealed the bag. "Write what happened, not what you think it means." I wrote it. I wrote that we had received a false authority into a non-existent sighting, that all communication and navigation systems had failed simultaneously, and that something had struck the locomotive hard enough to damage steel. I did not write what I had seen standing between the rails at the mouth of that unlisted bore. I did not write about the signal lenses where its eyes should have been, or the brass keys tied on wire across its chest, or the way its joints bent wrong when it charged. Drew read my statement twice, then put it in his case file without comment. Mario resigned 3 weeks later. He called me from his kitchen and told me he was done. His voice sounded flat, like he had practiced the words until they stopped meaning anything. "I came back because I wasn't leaving you to finish this alone," he said. "But I can't do it again, Eli. I can't sit in that cab waiting for the next time dispatch isn't dispatch." I did not argue. I had known it was coming since the moment he threw the throttle forward to get us out of that pass. A man could only ignore so many impossible things before his body made the choice his mind refused to make. "I understand," I said. "No," Mario said. "You don't, because you're still marked up." He was right. I was still marked up. I was still checking the call board. I was still carrying my grip to the van even though Mackenzie had asked me 3 times to leave it in the garage. Denise transferred off the dispatcher desk before the end of October. I only found out because I called Atlanta one night to confirm a bulletin, and a different voice answered. The new dispatcher told me Denise had requested reassignment to a daytime administrative role in a different region. 2 days later, I received an email from her personal account. The subject line was blank, The message read, Eli. I checked every incident again before I left the desk. The false authorities were never in the dispatch logs. Not one. Denise. I printed the email and put it in my grip with the rest of the paperwork I could not throw away. Then I sat at the kitchen table and tried to explain to Mackenzie why Denise's confirmation mattered, why it proved the pattern was real, why it meant I had not been imagining the voices or the orders or the men who should not have existed. Mackenzie did not let me finish. Promise me you won't take another call, she said. I looked at her across the table. She had her hands folded in front of her, fingers laced tight, and I could see she had been crying before I came home. Mackenzie, promise me, Eli. Promise me, Eli. I wanted to. I wanted to tell her I would walk away, that I would let someone else answer the phone when the crew caller rang at 2 a.m, that I would stop carrying my radio and my lantern and my laminated bulletins, like they were the only things keeping me tethered to a world that made sense. But I could not separate the job from the need to understand what had marked me. I could not promise to stop when I still did not know what I was stopping from. I can't, I said. She stood up. She did not shout. She did not slam anything. She just looked at me for a long time, and then she said, I married a railroader, Eli, not a man trying to get swallowed by the tracks. She moved in with her sister in Sandusky the following week. I helped her pack. I carried boxes to her car. I stood in the driveway and watched her pull away, and I did not try to stop her because I knew she was right. The railroad marked me off for medical review in early November. I sat across a desk from a company physician who asked me questions about stress and sleep and whether I had ever experienced auditory hallucinations. I answered honestly. I told him I had not imagined the voices, the authorities, the men in orange vests, the bunkhouse, the thing that struck the locomotive. I told him the evidence existed. I told him Drew Palmer had photographs, witness statements, physical samples, and dispatch logs that proved the false transmissions had never been issued by any real dispatcher. The physician made notes. He asked if I understood why the company needed to be cautious about returning crew members to service after traumatic incidents. I said I understood. He asked if I was willing to work with a counselor. I said I was. Then he asked what I thought had happened on the Allegheny Pass. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about Colton Tran's smile dropping when Denise denied his authority. I thought about Zayden Olsen whispering signal aspects before the mass came into view. I thought about Harold Blevins handing me a brass key from a building that had burned in 1983. I thought about the tapping inside the refrigerated boxcar and the pale figure crouched among frost and meat hooks. I thought about the thing with signal lenses for eyes, charging down the ballast toward my train. I don't know, I said. The physician closed his folder. That's an honest answer, Mr. Sawyer. It's the only one I have. He told me I would remain off the roster until the review was complete. He told me the company took these matters seriously and that my safety was the priority. He did not tell me whether he believed me, and I did not ask. Before I left the building, I stopped by the railroad police office to return my radio. Drew was at his desk, sorting through case files. He looked up when I set the radio on the counter. They're taking it for inspection, I said. Drew nodded. He did not look surprised. You know they won't find anything, Eli. I know. He leaned back in his chair. For what it's worth, I believe you saw what you said you saw. I believe Mario saw it too. I believe the grab iron didn't bend itself. and I believe that melted plastic came from something that shouldn't exist. He paused. But I can't put that in a report. I know, I said again. Good. He stood and handed me a business card with his personal cell number written on the back. Call me if anything else happens. Off the record. I took the card. I did not tell him that I already knew something else would happen, because the pattern had not stopped. It had only paused long enough to let me understand that it was not finished. I went home. I sat in the empty house. I checked the call board even though I was marked off. I walked to the window and looked across the street at the neighbor's house, and I thought about the night I had seen her door standing open in the dark. 2 nights later, I heard about the transmission. It came through a phone call from a conductor I had worked with years earlier, a man named Paul Hendricks, who was still running the Allegheny route. He called me at 11 at night and asked if I had heard what happened on the pass. What happened? I said. We got an authority, Paul said. His voice sounded tight, like he was trying to keep it steady. Clean transmission, proper format, our train symbol, our engineer's name, everything correct. I sat down. What did it say? Proceed into siding 19. I did not breathe for a moment. Then I said, Did you take it? Hell no, Paul said. I told my engineer to stop, and I called dispatch. They said they didn't issue it. They said the desk wasn't even keyed. But Eli, I heard it. My engineer heard it. It came through clear as anything. What did it sound like? I asked. Paul was quiet for a long time. Then he said, It sounded like Denise. I thanked him for calling. I hung up. I sat in the dark living room with my hands folded in my lap, and I thought about Denise's email. The false authorities were never in the dispatch logs, not one. The next morning, I called Drew. I told him what Paul had reported. Drew said he would follow up with the crew and request the radio logs from that night. He said he would let me know what he found. He called me back 3 hours later. The dispatcher on duty confirms he never touched his microphone, Drew said. The desk was quiet from 2300 to 0100. No transmissions, no authorities, nothing. But the crew heard it? I said. The crew heard it, Drew agreed. And the channel recorder picked it up. I closed my eyes. What did it say? Drew read it to me exactly the way Paul had described it. Proper format, proper cadence, the correct train symbol, and then, at the end, the order that should not have existed. Proceed into siding 19. I did not ask Drew what he thought it meant. I did not ask him whether he believed the voice had been real, or whether the crew had imagined it, or whether the recorder had malfunctioned in exactly the right way to produce a phantom authority. I already knew the answer. The pattern had not stopped. It had only moved to the next crew. It had found another train climbing the same pass, another dispatcher desk with a voice worth copying, another sighting that did not exist. It had given the order again, clean and correct and impossible, because that was what it did. It copied procedure until procedure became a trap. It spoke with authority until authority meant nothing. It waited in the dark stretches where the radio died and the signals lied, and the maps showed sightings that led nowhere. And it would keep doing it, one train at a time, until someone took the order. I hung up the phone. I sat in the empty house. I thought about Mario, who had resigned rather than wait for the next false transmission. I thought about Denise, who had transferred off the desk after checking every log and finding nothing. I thought about Mackenzie, who had left because I could not promise to stop. I thought about Paul Hendricks and his engineer climbing the Allegheny Pass with their radios open and their headlight cutting through the dark, waiting for the voice that would tell them where to go. I thought about the thing I had seen standing between the rails, with signal lenses for eyes and brass keys tied across its chest. I thought about the way it had charged when every system failed at once. I thought about the bent grab iron and the melted plastic and the unlisted bore that should not have existed. And I thought about the empty channel, carrying the words in Denise's stolen cadence, speaking to a crew that had not yet learned to refuse. Proceed into siding 19. The order continued without her.